It is said that deep within the dense, forgotten woods, there lives a figure known as the Bone Collector. Few speak of her, and those who do often share the tale around campfires, warning anyone who dares to enter her domain. No one knows exactly who she is or where she came from, but the stories all share one detail. She collects bones, human and animal alike, piecing them together in strange, unholy ways. The legend whispers that if you wander too far into the forest and hear the faint rattle of bones, it's already too late. She's already chosen you. A group of 4 friends had heard the story many times. They had laughed it off as just another campfire myth. These were the stories meant to scare children, after all. Alex, Mark, Emily, and Sarah loved the thrill of the unknown. So when they planned their next camping trip, they chose a remote location far from civilization. It was the kind of place that wasn't on maps, a perfect escape from their everyday lives. Alex had heard about the area from a local, an older man with wild eyes, who warned him about the forest. People go missing there, the man had said, but Alex shrugged it off. To him, it was just part of the excitement. After all, he didn't believe in superstitions or old ghost stories. He didn't mention this encounter to his friends either. They wouldn't have cared anyway. As the 4 friends set off on their hike into the woods, they couldn't shake a strange feeling. The air was thick, and the trees seemed taller than normal, their branches clawing at the sky. There was something unnatural about how quiet the forest was. No birds, no animals, not even the sound of wind rustling the leaves. Still, they pushed on, laughing and joking to mask their unease. By the time they set up camp, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. They sat around the fire, passing a flask and telling stories, their voices barely masking the eerie silence that pressed in from the trees. It wasn't long before Alex brought up the legend of the Bone Collector. He grinned as he spoke, weaving the tale for his friends. But as he described the eerie figure that wandered the woods in search of bones, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter died down, and the group grew quiet. Emily, usually the skeptic, glanced nervously at the dark tree line. "Maybe we shouldn't joke about that," she muttered. But her words were met with chuckles from the others. They weren't afraid. Not yet. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, none of them noticed the faint rustling in the distance, the quiet sound of something moving between the trees. Something old. Something that had waited years for new visitors. Something that had already marked them. And the rattling began. The next morning, the group awoke early, the eerie feeling of the previous night lingering in the back of their minds. They packed up camp quickly, eager to explore deeper into the forest. The morning sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows over the narrow trail they followed. Alex led the way, map in hand, as they made their way further into the woods, laughing off the strange silence that hung in the air. As they walked, Emily couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. It was nothing obvious, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the faint sound of something moving in the distance, but it was enough to make her uneasy. She slowed her pace, letting Mark and Sarah get ahead, and found herself staring at the ground, lost in thought. Suddenly her foot kicked something hard. She stopped and knelt down, brushing aside the dirt and leaves to reveal a small, weathered bone. It looked old, yellowed by time. At first she thought it was from an animal, but the shape wasn't right. It was a finger bone, unmistakably human. "Guys, wait up," she called, her voice trembling just enough to catch their attention. The others turned back, curiosity mixed with annoyance. "What is it?" Mark asked, his voice impatient. Emily held up the bone. "I found this. It's not normal. It's human." Alex raised an eyebrow, but then grinned. "You're just freaked out by last night's story. This is probably from an old hunter or something. There's gotta be a logical explanation." Sarah, usually the most level-headed of the group, stepped closer to examine it. Her expression darkened. "Maybe we should head back. This place is giving me the creeps." But Alex wasn't having it. "Come on, it's just a bone. Don't let some old campfire story get to you." He tossed the bone aside and pushed forward on the trail, expecting the others to follow. Reluctantly they did. As they continued, the forest seemed to grow darker, even though it was still midday. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes, as though they were trying to trap the group beneath their shadow. Emily felt her heart pounding in her chest. Every step seemed to lead them further into a place that didn't want them there. It wasn't long before they began to notice more bones. At first they were small, animal bones scattered along the trail, but soon they found larger ones, some half buried in the dirt, others arranged in strange patterns along the path. There were femurs, ribs, even a cracked skull lying at the base of a tree. The deeper they went, the more frequent the bones became, as if they were being drawn into a graveyard hidden beneath the forest floor. "What the hell is this, Sarah?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark tried to laugh it off, but his voice wavered. "Maybe it's some kind of animal den, like a wolf or something." But there were no wolves here. There were no sounds of animals at all, not even birds. Just the oppressive silence of the woods, and the growing sense that something ancient and terrible was watching them. Finally they reached a clearing, and what they saw stopped them in their tracks. In the center of the clearing stood a small, weathered shack, barely more than a pile of rotting wood and stones. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, yet it radiated a sense of malice, as though it was waiting for them. And scattered around the shack, half hidden in the tall grass, were bones. Hundreds of bones, some arranged in strange, ritualistic patterns, others tossed haphazardly as if discarded after use. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned to go, a soft sound drifted through the trees. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the pounding of their hearts, but as it grew louder, they recognized it. The unmistakable sound of bones rattling together. The bone collector had found them. The rattling sound echoed through the clearing, faint but unmistakable. The group froze in place, every sense heightened by the sudden realization that they were not alone. The strange, unnatural sound seemed to come from all directions, wrapping around them like the cold fingers of a long-forgotten nightmare. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible as she gripped Mark's arm tightly. Alex, trying to maintain his bravado, glanced around the clearing. "It's just the wind or something. Probably just this old shack settling. Let's check it out, and then we can head back." But even he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. Mark took a deep breath and stepped toward the shack, his curiosity winning out over his growing fear. The others hesitated, but followed closely behind. The small wooden structure seemed even more dilapidated up close, its door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Vines had crawled their way up the walls, and the roof was barely intact, with gaping holes that let in thin streams of daylight. The air inside was thick with decay, and something far worse, the lingering scent of death. As they pushed open the door, a cloud of dust swirled up from the ground, revealing a cramped interior filled with bones, human bones, animal bones, all piled up in the corners and hanging from the ceiling on strings like grotesque decorations. The sight of it all made Sarah gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, this isn't right. We need to get out of here." Alex, still trying to keep his composure, approached the largest pile of bones. Among them, he spotted something half buried in the dirt. He knelt down and brushed away the earth, revealing a skeletal hand, its long, bony fingers reaching out as if in silent agony. The fingers were bound together with what looked like old, fraying twine. It wasn't an accident. Someone, or something, had arranged it that way. "I think we should listen to Sarah," Mark muttered, his voice now completely devoid of its earlier confidence. "This place, it feels wrong." Just as he spoke, a sudden gust of wind howled through the trees outside, slamming the shack's door shut with a deafening bang. The group jumped, and Sarah let out a small scream. "That's it," Emily said firmly, backing toward the door. "We're leaving, now." But as they turned to leave, something caught Mark's eye. Behind the shack, just barely visible through the cracks in the walls, was another clearing, a larger one, and in the middle of it stood a pit. The edges of the pit were lined with even more bones, arranged in bizarre, twisted patterns that looked almost ritualistic. And at the bottom of the pit, something shimmered faintly in the dim light. Mark moved toward the window, trying to get a better look. "There's something out there," he murmured. The others followed his gaze, their faces pale, as they too saw the pit. But it wasn't just the bones that caught their attention. It was what lay in the center of the pit. A figure, a human figure, partially buried, its skeletal remains twisted and broken, as though it had been tossed in carelessly after death. But that wasn't all. Around the skeleton's neck was a necklace made entirely of bones, strung together like beads, and clutched tightly in its hand was a small, crudely carved totem made from what looked like human teeth. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through Emily. "We have to go. We're not supposed to be here," she said, her voice shaking. Alex stepped back from the window, his face drained of color. "This can't be real. Someone must have set this up, right? It's a joke. It has to be." But deep down, they all knew. This was no joke. This was something ancient, something evil, something that had been waiting for them since the moment they set foot in the woods. The rattling sound returned, louder this time, echoing from the trees just beyond the clearing. It was closer now, no longer distant or hidden by the wind, and with it came another sound, soft, shuffling footsteps, like something was dragging itself across the forest floor. "We have to run," Mark whispered, barely able to force the words out. But it was too late. From the edge of the clearing, the bone collector appeared. She moved slowly, her tall, skeletal form barely visible in the shadows of the trees. Her limbs were long and thin, her skin stretched tight over bone. Her face was obscured by a tattered veil, and around her neck, she wore a necklace just like the one on the skeleton in the pit, only hers was far larger, filled with the bones of countless victims. She stood silently for a moment, watching them. Then, with a single bony finger, she beckoned them forward. The rattling grew louder, as if the bones themselves were alive, vibrating with an unnatural energy. The group stood frozen, unable to move, trapped in their horror. The bone collector stood at the edge of the clearing, her skeletal frame barely visible beneath the dark veil that covered her face. The rattling sound, like dry bones clattering together, grew louder with every passing second, echoing through the dense forest around them. None of the friends could move. They were paralyzed by the sheer terror of what they were seeing, a nightmare made real. Emily's breath came in short, panicked gasps. Her heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst from her chest. She clung to Mark, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "We have to run," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But her legs wouldn't move. No one's would. It was as if the forest itself was holding them in place, trapping them in this moment of horror. Then the bone collector moved. Slowly, almost deliberately, she began to shuffle forward, her feet dragging across the dirt as though she was barely able to carry her own weight. Each step was accompanied by that same terrible rattling, as if the bones she collected were part of her, bound to her in ways that defied reason. "We need to go," Alex finally managed to say, his voice shaking. "We can't just stand here." Mark snapped out of his paralysis and grabbed Emily's hand. "Come on, run!" With that, the spell seemed to break. The group bolted from the clearing, their feet pounding against the forest floor as they sprinted blindly into the trees. Branches whipped at their faces, and the ground beneath them was uneven, but fear drove them forward. They could still hear the rattling behind them, faint but relentless, like death itself was chasing them. The forest felt endless. No matter how far they ran, the trees looked the same, and the oppressive darkness only seemed to deepen. The sunlight, which had been dim to begin with, disappeared completely, as though the forest itself was swallowing the light. Emily stumbled, nearly falling to her knees, but Mark yanked her back up, urging her forward. "Don't stop, keep going." But no matter how fast they ran, the rattling grew louder. And now there was something else, a soft, whispering voice, like the wind carrying faint words they couldn't understand. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We're going in circles," Sarah cried, her voice filled with panic. She was right. Every turn they took, every path they tried, led them back to the same spot. The forest was playing tricks on them, twisting and turning, warping their sense of direction. "We can't be," Alex argued, though even he knew it was true. The sense of dread was overwhelming now, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes it impossible to think clearly. As they ran, they started to see things, shadows darting between the trees, strange shapes moving in the distance, and worse, they began finding more bones, scattered along the ground, hanging from branches, embedded in the trunks of the trees themselves. Human bones, animal bones, all arranged in eerie patterns that seemed to mock them. Then Sarah screamed. The group stopped in their tracks, turning to see what had happened. Sarah stood frozen, staring at her arm. There on her wrist was a mark, a thin, pale line, as if something had scratched her with a bony finger. "It's her," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "She marked me." Suddenly, the forest fell completely silent. The rattling stopped. The whispers faded into nothingness. For a brief, terrifying moment, it was as if the entire world had paused, waiting. And then the bone collector's voice broke the silence. Soft and chilling, it drifted through the trees like a deadly lullaby. "You cannot run from me. Your bones are mine." Without warning, Sarah was yanked backward into the darkness. She didn't even have time to scream. One moment she was there, and the next she was gone, swallowed by the forest. The others could only watch in horror, powerless to stop it. Panic erupted. They screamed her name, but there was no answer, no sound, except for the faint, distant rattling of bones. Sarah had been taken. Mark turned to the others, his face pale. "We need to leave this place. Now, before she gets the rest of us." But how could they? The forest was endless, a labyrinth that twisted back on itself. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into her domain. Emily's mind raced. Maybe we're marked too," she whispered, glancing down at her own arms, terrified of finding the same mark Sarah had. Alex shook his head, trying to stay calm. "We'll find a way out. We just need to." Before he could finish, something crashed through the trees. The bone collector was no longer hiding. She was coming for them, slowly, relentlessly, the rattling growing louder with each step she took. They ran again, but it was futile. The forest had claimed them, and somewhere, deep in the darkness, the bone collector's voice whispered, "I will have your bones." The forest was alive with the sound of the bone collector's approach. The rattling of bones, once faint and distant, was now deafening, as if the entire forest floor was shifting beneath their feet. Every tree they passed seemed to whisper their doom, and every shadow seemed to reach out for them, pulling them back toward the inevitable. Mark, Alex, and Emily ran as fast as their legs could carry them, their breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how hard they pushed themselves, the bone collector seemed to be right behind them. Her slow, deliberate footsteps were steady, unhurried, as though she knew they could never truly escape. "We have to split up," Alex shouted between breaths. "She can't follow all of us at once." Mark looked at him, terrified. "Are you crazy? We need to stay together." "No. We'll cover more ground if we split," Alex insisted, desperation creeping into his voice. "We'll find a way out." Emily, still in shock from Sarah's sudden disappearance, could barely think straight. Her mind was spinning with panic, her body screaming for rest. But she knew Alex might be right. They were running in circles. Something unnatural was keeping them trapped. Maybe if they split up, one of them would find a way out of this nightmare. "Fine," Mark relented, his voice tight with fear. "But we meet back at the campsite if we get separated." With that, the three of them scattered into different directions, each darting into the dark, twisted maze of trees, praying that they were making the right choice. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she ran, her footsteps frantic against the damp ground. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to stop, but she couldn't, not with the rattling sound still echoing behind her. As she tore through the woods, her thoughts raced. This isn't real. It can't be real. But it was. Sarah was gone, taken by something that shouldn't exist, and now she was next. The bone collector had marked them, chosen them, and no matter how fast they ran, there was no escaping her reach. Emily stumbled over a root, crashing to the ground hard. She winced in pain, scrambling to her feet, but something made her pause. Just ahead of her, at the base of a large ancient tree, she saw it, another bone. But this one was different. It wasn't just a random fragment like the others they had seen. It was a skull, human, and it wasn't alone. The entire area was littered with bones, all arranged in careful patterns. Some were laid out in spirals, others in neat rows, as if someone, or something, had been placing them there for a long time. Emily's breath hitched in her throat. She had wandered into one of the bone collector's graveyards. Before she could move, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of bones rattling directly behind her. Slowly, trembling, she turned around. The bone collector stood just a few feet away. Her figure was even more terrifying up close. She towered over Emily, impossibly tall, her thin, emaciated body draped in tattered rags that fluttered in the breeze like ghostly remnants of a forgotten life. Her skin was a sickly pale, stretched so tightly over her bones that it looked like it might tear at any moment. and her face. Emily couldn't see it clearly beneath the veil, but she could feel the collector's hollow eyes locked on her. For a moment, the bone collector didn't move. She stood silently, her bony fingers outstretched as if waiting for Emily to come to her willingly. The rattling sound came from all around her, as if the bones she had collected over centuries were alive, restless in their hunger for more. Emily backed away slowly, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body frozen in place by sheer terror. The bone collector took a step forward, her long, skeletal limbs creaking like ancient wood. The rattling intensified, louder and louder, until it seemed to vibrate in Emily's very bones. She turned and ran. Branches whipped at her face, tearing at her clothes as she sprinted through the underbrush, her only thought to get away. But no matter how fast she ran, the rattling followed her, relentless and inescapable. It was as if the entire forest was alive with it, as though the bones of those the collector had taken before were now calling out to her, beckoning her to join them. Suddenly, she burst into another clearing. Her heart soared with hope as she recognized the campsite ahead. Mark and Alex were already there, looking just as shaken as she felt. But before she could call out to them, she noticed something strange. They weren't alone. Standing between the tents, her back turned to the group, was Sarah. "Sarah," Emily cried out, her voice trembling with relief and confusion. Mark and Alex looked at her, their faces pale. "She's been here," Alex muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But something's wrong." As Emily approached, she realized what he meant. Sarah wasn't moving. She stood completely still, unnaturally rigid, her head slightly tilted to one side, as if listening for something. And then, slowly, she turned to face them. Emily gasped. Sarah's eyes were wide and vacant, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that didn't reach her eyes. But what sent a chill down Emily's spine was what she saw in Sarah's hand. A small human bone, a finger bone. Before anyone could react, Sarah spoke, her voice hollow and cold. "She's coming for you next." The rattling grew deafening. The deafening rattling of bones surrounded them, reverberating through the trees and seeming to come from everywhere at once. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at Sarah, who stood motionless in the clearing, clutching the small human bone in her hand. There was something deeply wrong about her, her vacant eyes, her twisted smile. It was as if she was no longer Sarah at all. Mark stepped forward, his voice shaky. "Sarah, what happened to you? We need to get out of here. Come with us." But Sarah didn't respond. She just stood there, her eyes glassy and empty, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. Slowly she lifted her head, and that same bone-chilling smile spread across her face. "She's here," Sarah whispered, her voice low and unnervingly calm. "She's already taken me. Now, it's your turn." Suddenly the rattling stopped. The forest fell into a silence so thick, so oppressive, that it seemed to press down on them, suffocating the air. Every sound was swallowed by the dark, leaving only the pounding of their hearts. Then, from the edge of the clearing, the bone collector emerged. She moved slowly, almost gliding across the ground, her tall, skeletal figure towering over them. Her body was cloaked in shadows, her bony hands outstretched toward the group. The tattered veil still covered her face, but they could feel her eyes, empty, hollow, and filled with a hunger that spanned centuries, locked onto them. Mark stepped back, his voice trembling. "We have to go, now." But before they could move, Sarah's body jerked unnaturally, her arms and legs twitching as if controlled by invisible strings. She turned to face them fully, and Emily let out a gasp of horror. Sarah's body was changing. Her skin was growing pale and taut, pulling tighter against her bones, almost as if it was shrinking. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and a sickening crack echoed through the clearing as her spine twisted at an impossible angle. She wasn't Sarah anymore. The bone collector raised one hand, and as she did, Sarah began to move toward them, her limbs jerking in unnatural, puppet-like movements. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. She was being controlled, used as a tool to bring them closer to the collector. Mark grabbed Alex's arm, pulling him back. "Run. Don't let her touch you." But Emily stood frozen, her eyes locked on Sarah. This was her friend, her best friend, and now she was nothing more than a hollow shell, a puppet for the bone collector's dark will. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she knew there was no saving Sarah. Whatever had taken her was irreversible. "Emily, come on," Alex shouted, snapping her out of her trance. They bolted, sprinting into the woods once again, but the forest had changed. The trees seemed closer, their branches weaving together to form walls that blocked their path. The ground beneath them was soft and uneven, like they were running through a graveyard, and the bones were everywhere, sticking up from the earth, hanging from trees, scattered across the forest floor, like grotesque reminders of those who had come before them. The rattling had returned, louder now, more insistent, and mixed with it was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming closer with every second. Emily's lungs burned, her legs ached, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not when the bone collector was so close. Behind them they heard a horrifying scream, Sarah's voice, twisted and distorted, calling out to them, "Don't leave me, come back." Emily turned, just for a second, and saw her friend's contorted figure, stumbling after them, her limbs moving in ways they shouldn't, her face locked in that same twisted smile. The sight made her stomach churn, but she kept running. They burst into another clearing, but this one was different. In the center of the clearing stood the pit, the same pit they had seen before, filled with bones, but now it seemed deeper, darker, as though it had no bottom. The air around it was cold, biting, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Mark stopped, his face pale. "We're trapped." There was no way out. The trees had closed in around them, forming a twisted maze with no escape, and the bone collector was right behind them, her presence pressing in on them like a suffocating fog. "We're not getting out of this, are we?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't think so." The bone collector appeared at the edge of the clearing, her bony fingers outstretched, beckoning them toward the pit. The rattling was so loud now that it seemed to come from inside their heads, vibrating in their skulls, drowning out every thought, every hope. Mark stepped forward, his face blank, as though he had already accepted his fate. Maybe if we give her what she wants, she'll let us go." Alex grabbed him. "No, don't." But it was too late. Mark moved toward the pit, his eyes locked on the bone collector, as if drawn to her by some invisible force. He stepped to the edge and knelt down, placing his hands on the bones. The moment his fingers touched them, the rattling stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was silence. Then, with a deafening crack, the ground beneath Mark gave way. The pit opened up, swallowing him whole in a single, horrifying instant. His scream echoed through the clearing, but it was cut short, swallowed by the darkness below. Emily and Alex stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror. The bone collector moved closer, her bony hands outstretched toward them. There was no escape. The pit was calling, and they knew, deep down, that it would claim them too. The last thing Emily saw before the darkness took her was the bone collector's face, hidden beneath the veil, smiling. And then there was nothing, just the sound of bones rattling in the wind. The clearing fell into a chilling silence after Mark's final scream was swallowed by the pit. Emily and Alex stood frozen, staring at the void where their friend had disappeared. The ground, once stable, now felt as though it might crumble beneath their feet at any moment. The air was heavy, suffocating, filled with an unbearable tension that pressed down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. The bone collector remained at the edge of the pit, her tall, skeletal figure eerily still. Her veil, tattered and frayed, fluttered slightly in the cold, unnatural breeze that seemed to emanate from the pit itself. Her bony hands reached out, beckoning them forward. Though she didn't speak, she didn't need to. The message was clear. Their fate was sealed. "We need to move," Alex whispered, his voice barely a breath. His eyes were wide with fear, his body trembling. "We have to get out of here." But Emily couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by an overwhelming sense of dread. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the pit, the dark abyss that had just swallowed her friend whole. She could still hear the faint echo of Mark's scream reverberating in her mind, twisting her thoughts into a spiral of panic and despair. "She's going to take us," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. "There's no way out." "No!" Alex grabbed her arm, shaking her, trying to snap her out of it. "We can't give up. We're not letting her win." But even as he spoke, the ground beneath them began to shift. The bones scattered across the clearing seemed to move on their own, rattling softly as they arranged themselves into strange patterns, spiraling toward the pit like some kind of dark, ritualistic offering. The bone collector's presence grew stronger, more oppressive, as if she was drawing power from the very earth beneath them. And then, from the depths of the pit, a sound rose. It wasn't the rattling of bones this time. It was something far worse, a deep, guttural moan, like the sound of something ancient and hungry, stirring from its long slumber. The pit was alive, and it was calling for them. "We can't go near it," Alex said, pulling Emily back as the ground continued to tremble. "We have to find another way. There has to be—" But before he could finish, a sharp, bone-chilling crack split the air. The ground beneath them began to split open, jagged lines forming in the dirt as the pit expanded, creeping closer and closer to where they stood. Emily stumbled backward, her heart racing as she watched the earth crack and crumble, revealing more bones buried just beneath the surface. "We're going to fall in," Emily cried, panic overtaking her. Just then, the bone collector moved. Slowly, she stepped toward them, her skeletal fingers curling in a beckoning gesture. She didn't speak, but the rattling of the bones around her grew louder, as if urging them to come closer, to surrender to the darkness that awaited them. Alex tightened his grip on Emily's arm. "Run!" They bolted, sprinting toward the tree line, desperate to escape the expanding pit. But the forest was no longer just a forest. The trees twisted and contorted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, blocking their path. The ground beneath them shifted and buckled, as if the entire forest was working against them, forcing them back toward the bone collector. Every step they took brought them closer to exhaustion. The pit was growing, spreading, devouring everything in its path. Emily could feel it, an unnatural force pulling at her, tugging her back toward the abyss. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep running, she had to survive, but the forest wouldn't let them go. As they ran, the trees closed in around them, the path twisting and turning into an impossible maze. Every direction they took led them back to the clearing, to the pit, to the bone collector, standing silently at its edge, waiting for them to make their final move. "We're trapped," Alex shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's not going to let us go." Emily's chest tightened with fear as they skidded to a stop, their backs to the pit. There was nowhere left to run. The bone collector loomed before them, her figure a dark, twisted silhouette against the pale moonlight. Her presence was overwhelming now, suffocating, as though the very air had been drained from the forest, leaving only the hollow rattling of bones to fill the void. Emily glanced at Alex, her heart sinking. There was no escape. They had been marked from the moment they entered the forest, chosen by the bone collector, destined to become part of her ever-growing collection. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Before Alex could respond, the ground beneath them gave way. The pit opened up, its gaping maw swallowing them whole. Emily screamed as she fell into the darkness, her body tumbling through the void. The last thing she saw was the bone collector's veil fluttering in the wind, her skeletal hands reaching out, pulling them down into the pit where the bones of the lost awaited. And then there was silence. The forest stood still once again, the rattling of bones fading into the night. The pit closed, leaving no trace of the two who had been taken. The bone collector stood at the edge, her task complete. She turned and disappeared into the trees, her presence fading into the shadows as the forest reclaimed its eerie quiet. In the clearing, the wind stirred, and the bones rattled softly, waiting for the next lost souls to wander into the woods, waiting for the bone collector's next offering.